US. And if you're good at it, what you will do is you'll set up a kind of Russian doll model whereby one company is actually owned by another company, which in turn is owned by a third company, a fourth, and so on. And ideally, what you would do is you would incorporate each of these different companies, each of these different layers, in a different secrecy jurisdiction, thereby making it pretty much impossible for anybody, even law enforcement agencies, to uncover what you're doing and trace the money back to you. So this then puts you in a very good position to flow money through all these different companies and then spend it in a way which can't be traced back to you in the way in which you stole it in the first place. And then this takes us on to this third phase in the cycle, the spend phase, which connects very directly with golden visas. Having stolen this money and stashed it offshore in your secrecy jurisdiction, bank accounts and companies, you're now in a position to spend it. But how? What do you spend it on? Well, any self-respecting despot is going to have to use quite a lot of that money for political patronage, election rigging, perhaps acts of orchestrated political violence to keep themselves in power. But with those things sort of under wraps, you can start to think about the finer things in life. And those might include a private school education for your kids, a fleet of luxury vehicles, a very large mansion, or maybe 2 or 3. And also, perhaps a plan B, a sort of backup plan if things go wrong. And that's where golden visas come in. And that's why we think this issue is so pressing and so much needs addressing. Buying citizenship or residency in another country via golden visas, as our report shows, can be quite expensive, but in the scheme of things, it's actually a relatively small investment because it gives you and your family permanent security if things get too hot at home. After all, if you get a second passport, and the passport is from a country which has no extradition treaty with your home country, you're in a pretty good safe position. You can sleep securely in your luxury mansion at night. So with all this context, we weren't that surprised when last year The Guardian, through the reporting of David Pegg in particular, who's here today, uncovered a range of very significant risks in terms of the operation of golden visa schemes across Europe. So David uncovered, for instance, the ways in which figures in companies implicated in the Brazil car wash scandal, also senior officials and aides in Angola who are very much linked to major corruption cases, Russian billionaires, members of the political elite in Ukraine who've been accused of corruption, who've all been benefiting from golden visa schemes, in those cases run by Portugal and Cyprus. So in summary, it's this ability to steal, stash and spend money that makes corruption not only possible, but also attractive. And so today's report forms part of our work to break that spend phase in the corruption cycle by closing down the safe havens for the corrupt. And we're really delighted to have had the chance to collaborate with TI on this. And with that, I'm going to hand back to Carl, who's going to introduce the rest of the programme.
Thank you very much, Mike. So you've got a copy of the report in front of you, hopefully. You've also got an executive summary in this very neatly designed booklet here. But to guide you through this for the next 15 to 20 minutes or so, we have the authors behind the report, the main authors behind the report. So we have Laura Brio, who's a policy officer here in the Transparency International EU office, and also Mara Martini, who's a knowledge coordinator at the Transparency International Secretariat in Berlin. So Laura, I believe you're up first. So over to you.
Is it working? Hi everyone. So I'll start by providing you with an overview of the phenomenon in the EU. And provide also an overview of the risk that poses to the EU, this scheme poses to the EU. And then I'll pass it on to Myra to just go a bit deeper into the risk, looking at 3 countries in particular, Malta, Cyprus and Portugal, and also taking an example from other schemes whenever necessary. So perhaps let me just start by clarifying what we mean by golden visas, because it's no official terminology. We define it as those schemes that offer fast-track route to citizenship and residence to wealthy investors in exchange for significant investment in the country. We only included schemes that were requiring some passive forms of investment, like investment in luxury properties, in the government bonds, in social development funds, or in existing companies, for example. So the EU market represent the higher end of the market. Its EU schemes represent the higher end of the market. So the average cost of the most popular scheme in the EU is more like 900,000 euros compared to a range of 150,000 or 400,000 to 400,000 for USD dollar for Caribbean schemes. So what as Carl mentioned, the stories revealed in the press conference we had back in March were really good at pointing at like specific problems and issues that posed by the schemes, but we were missing a bit the big picture, like what was the scale of the phenomenon in the EU, how many countries were we talking about, how much money were we talking about, how many applicants, how many passports and visas sold. And so that's the work we've been doing over the past few months, try to just go into this, like go country by country and try to identify those that had schemes. And so we came up with few stats, key figures and facts. The first one is that we've got 4 countries selling citizenship. It's Australia, Bulgaria, Malta and Cyprus. We've got 12 plus 1 countries selling residence. It's Bulgaria, Cyprus, France, Greece, Ireland, Latvia, Luxembourg, Malta, Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, and the UK. And I'm saying plus 1 because until this summer, actually July this year, Hungary was also selling off visas, the golden visas, but their program was suspended. Actually, over controversy in the way intermediaries had been selected and in controversies over their role in the scheme. Based on available statistics, it's not always easy. It's not been easy to find statistics for all schemes, and we didn't manage to find them for all. But we can say that at least 25 billion euros have been invested in the EU since the start of this program. So more or less over the past decade, which correspond to 100,000 visas sold and 100,000 new residents and 6,000 new citizens. If we zoom in at country level, the top performers in terms of investment, like in terms of annual average investment, are Spain, Cyprus and Portugal. We are between $500 million and $1 billion. In relative terms, the numbers are so quite impressive for small economies like Malta or Cyprus. For example, in Cyprus, the annual average investment represented 5.2% of the GDP in 2017. One thing we should alert on, so is indeed that's been a good way for this economy to boost private sector investment and increase fiscal revenue for those countries, but it also presents some fiscal and macroeconomic risk due to the volatile nature of these flows. If now I just look at sorry, I'm just really bad at following slides. So if I look at applicants, the highest number can be found in Spain, Hungary, Latvia, Portugal and the UK, where we have above 10,000 successful applicants since the start of this program. This is the country of origins of and next in line we have Greece, Cyprus and Malta. Another interesting indicator we looked at is the success rate of applications. For example, for countries where we had data available, we found over 90% of success rate in Hungary, Latvia or the UK, for example. And this suggests that this country might not have been particularly selective when selecting applicants. It also raised doubts on the strictness and rigor with which this application has been screened. So this is for the overview, just to give you an idea of the scale of the phenomenon. But so now what's the problem? Why are we, as anti-corruption activists, looking at this issue? It's actually because we found that those schemes poses a series of risks in the member state, but also for the EU as a whole. The first type of risk we've observed is the risk of letting people, high-risk profile people, entering the EU and possibly the corrupt individuals and criminals as a result of insufficient due diligence and control and check applied on applicants when screening the applications. We're talking here about high net worth individuals, about sometimes politically exposed person that invest a big chunk of money in one go, and we found that usually the procedures that are in place are ill-adapted, are not enough to screen those applications. The second type of risk is the risk of corruption of the states themselves. We've observed that in some countries, poor governance practices, discretionary decision making, unclear role of intermediaries that are not always subject to AML like anti-money laundering regulations, lack of independent oversight, risk of conflict of interest, and all this is another risk of government officials making discretionary decisions, exercising undue influence, or just overlooking some red flags and let some criminals or corrupt individuals enter the EU and travel uninjured throughout the EU. The last type of risk, the last type of risk is related to the lack of harmonization of EU standards and practices, of standards and practices at EU level, which may encourage passport shopping on the side of applicants that may be looking for the jurisdiction that offer the lowest bid, and on the side of member state may encourage a race to the bottom to appear as more attractive and more competitive on the market. The ultimate risk is that the EU integrity and the collective security of EU nation is undermined, just as a result of lack of controls and lack of proper governance of the schemes. So now I will pass it on to Myra, who will just go a bit deeper into the details of this risk by providing some concrete examples and cases.
Thanks, Laura. I don't know why this keeps switching up. Yeah. So to understand a bit better these risks, what we did, we dig deeper into the schemes operated in Cyprus, Malta, and Portugal. Let's start by having a look at Cyprus. So since 2013, Cyprus has sold more than 3,000 passports. It sounds fine, right? No, but there was a huge problem. Even government officials stated themselves that there has been genuine abuses to the program. So this happened because the government of Cyprus seemed to have conducted little to no due diligence on applicants. This means that it could be that oligarchs and crooks may be allowed to circulate freely in the EU at the moment. They can open bank accounts, they can create companies, they can buy real estate. So Cyprus actually suffered quite a bit of criticism recently. So the government decided to adopt some change earlier this year, mid-June, beginning of July. They were started to be implemented now in August. So now they decided that accredited agents that are simply intermediaries, who firms where people who want to apply need to approach them first, will be the ones responsible for conducting due diligence and submitting a report then to the government authorities in Cyprus. Still, yet, it seems that authorities in Cyprus don't conduct any checks themselves. No enhanced checks are conducted, and in particular, does not seem that the source of funds and wealth of these applicants are checked. the problem now is that we have seen that there is very little information about the scheme, and the names of the applicants are not made publicly available, which, and the secrecy around them makes it more difficult for us to ascertain the extent to which corrupt or criminals actually enter the EU. But there is some stories that were published last year that show that we have certainly attracted conservation figures from Ukraine, Russia, and Syria, many of whom have their names included in sanctioned lists, and they all got passports from Cyprus. So as it stands now, in spite of reforms, Cyprus golden visa remains at risk of exposing the EU to the corrupt and criminals. Let's have a look at Malta. So Malta's program was launched in 2014. It's called the Individual Investor Program. And since then, more than 2,000 foreigners have been awarded a passport. The program also has not been without controversies. The EU was really critical of the program back in 2014, which led to a series of reforms being made. It's true that in comparison to other programs, Malta does publish more information about how the selection process happens and what type of checks are done on applicants. But the problem is that they say that they have what they call a so-called 4-tier due diligence process that seems more stringent than other checks conducted in other places. But there is one issue, that is the issue that Maltese authorities actually enjoy a lot of discretion when dealing with the findings of this due diligence. So the law states, for example, that a person with a criminal background or a person who is currently under criminal investigation shouldn't be entitled to even apply for a golden visa or a passport in Malta. But the law also says that in special circumstances, this person can be accepted by the authorities in Malta. What is considered as special circumstances is only up to Maltese authorities to decide. And news that Russian oligarchs who could have been enriched through corruption had recently got Maltese passports make us worried. Are the Maltese authorities taking the necessary the risk appetite is appropriate to the level of risk that the scheme posed to the EU or not. So Laura mentioned there are other types of risks. So there is also the type of risk that the countries are corrupt themselves. And the report, we mentioned a couple of situations in looking at how the scheme in Malta is organized that could cause corruption in Malta. I'm not going to enter in a lot of detail here. I perhaps only want to mention to you the lack of transparency and accountability in the management of funds obtained through the program. They set up a special fund for this that is to be used for social development of the country. It's not very clear how decisions are made on how these funds are used. The last we heard was that they decided to buy shares of a bank. So it raised a bit of criticism whether this is an appropriate and adequate investment for the money. We also highlight another type of risk that could raise conflicts of interest. That is the role of the intermediate agents. In particular in Malta, they have a figure of the concessionaire. That is someone who was awarded a public contract to administer the program and play quite a significant role in the administration of the program. In this case, it's the firm Healy & Partners, and according to the law, they could also be the ones bringing in clients. So it's a bit tricky to see where the line is drawn and whether or not this could generate a conflict of interest. And finally, we move on to Portugal. The country operates a residence by investment program. Just to say that the other two countries we just mentioned, I focus on the citizenship programs. They also operate residence by investment programs that are regulated by different laws and usually overseen by different authorities. We have more information on those in the report as well. The program in Portugal can lead. It's an indirect route to citizenship. So if you are awarded a golden visa in Portugal after 6 years, you have the right to apply for a citizenship. The Portugal scheme illustrates well these two types of risks I was talking about. So on one hand, the lack of checks on the source of funds and wealth could make it easier for the corrupt and other criminals to launder money through the program. On the other hand, poor governance and lack of transparency and accountability mechanisms offer opportunity for corruption within the country. So back in 2014, I think this is a well-known story, senior public officials in Portugal were bribed by 3 Chinese executives, so they would turn a blind eye to the fact that they haven't really complied to the program's requirements. They are under a prosecution now. We also have seen a story by The Guardian where executives from the Brazilian construction companies involved in the car wash scandal in Brazil were also awarded golden visas in Portugal. While there was no criminal conviction at the time, this happened really in the middle of the investigation. So at that time, there was already sufficient evidence by prosecutors in Brazil that would show the involvement of construction companies in the Petrobras scandal. So I think a proper due diligence check that wouldn't only look at criminal records, but only on investigations and background, and do a better analysis could have spotted that. And in Portugal, another issue also relates to the family members who they don't need to apply for the golden visa, but only later to family reunion. So this means that an individual could be used as a Trojan horse to then bring other corrupt individuals as family members. Yeah, so as we saw, this is really a EU-wide problem. We saw that there are member states that have different programs, they apply different criteria, they have different risk appetite, but all of them sell the same thing, that is EU citizenship and EU residency rights. So what we need to ensure is that the checks and the risk appetite appetite of this member states operating these programs do not expose the whole EU to corruption. So that's why we put forward a set of recommendations to member states and to the EU to show how to improve these programs, and that we hope that we can discuss this with you in the next hour.
Thank you very much, Myra. Hopefully now these presentations and the report shed a small ray of sunshine into this very murky world. But I think one of the main things to emphasize is that despite the fact that Myra and Laura and colleagues at Global Witness have beavered away at this report for months and months and compiled everything we know about these schemes into this report, there's still so much that we don't know. There's still so much lack of transparency about how these schemes operate and exactly what due diligence is done. So now we move to the second part of our program, where we focus, as I said, on the fact that this is a European problem and that there is a role for the European Union to play in addressing this problem. I mentioned before that this is a sequel. I really hope this is the second and last in the series. We don't want this to become a franchise like The Fast and the Furious, where we endlessly come back to Brussels pointing out that the inadequacies of these schemes and the fact that nothing has been done and there has been inaction from member states in the EU. So we as I said, we are expecting a report from the European Commission very soon on this, and we very much hope that that is a report with some actionable consequences with it. So if I can invite David and the other panelists up to the podium here, and we will carry on now with the second part of the program. And afterwards, you, of course, will get opportunities to ask questions about anything the panelists have said or anything you've heard in this first part of the program as well. Thank you.
Hello everyone, good morning. Thank you very much to Carl, Mike, Laura and Myra for that. By way of brief introduction, My name is David Pegg. I'm a journalist at the Guardian newspaper in London, and Global Witness and TI have kindly invited me here to kind of chair the panel. We've done a little bit of work at the Guardian looking at this issue in particular, and one of the things that I think is very striking is the speed with which the issue of golden visas has risen in saliency in what is a comparatively short period of time. I think we first became aware of the issue in 2015 when Transparency International wrote a report on the problems with the UK system. We wrote some articles about this last year. And within just this year alone, the UK has said it's going to review the Tier 1 visas granted to Russians prior to 2015 in the aftermath of the Salisbury attack. Vera Jourova is preparing guidance for member states on how they can better implement these procedures. And I mean, I think we mentioned the Finnish case that occurred 2 weeks ago, and there's presently a case going through the UK courts at the moment involving an unexplained wealth order, and there's an investor visa question as part of that as well. So it's risen in prominence very, very quickly. Mike spoke very kindly about our work at The Guardian last year. I just wanted to stress that that was very much a team effort. It was brought to us by Sarah Farolfi, a freelance investigative journalist, and we worked with Stelios Orphanides in Cyprus and Mikael Pereira in Portugal as well. So by way of introduction, I think we're going to hear from each of the panelists for 5 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion and then open the floor to questions as well. So if we could start with Anna, that would be okay. Great. Thank you very much.
I'm from Portugal, and I was very pleased to hear what was said about Portugal, because it's what I've been trying to expose. I believe that indeed the system of golden visas, both the modality of citizenship and residence, is immoral. It's totally immoral when European member states are not allowing poor migrants to come to and let them die in the Mediterranean. Then they afford golden fast track to reach migrants. It's really outrageous. Second question is against our security, because as it has been already said, it abets corruption. It lends itself to importing crime, organized crime, money laundering, and so on. And it's a real prostitution of the Schengen system, because you go and you see that what is advertised by all these companies involved in the sale of citizenship or residence is that they advertise the Schengen system as, of course, a much prized objective for those who want the schemes. And then, of course, it's not true that it brings prosperity to the countries that operate this system. It may bring prosperity to some segments, namely the industry that has been mounted to deliver the golden visas inside the administrations and in the corporate world, namely in the lawyers, advisors of all sorts and so on. But it definitely does not benefit the whole population. On the contrary, it completely distorts the housing market, as we are seeing in Portugal and in other countries, Malta, Cyprus, and so on. I've been asked to talk about Malta because I've been following Malta, especially in the context of the Panama Papers inquiry in the European Parliament, and also in the aftermath of the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. She wrote extensively about the operation of the golden visas in Malta, which is called the IIP, Individuals Investors Program. And you see that at the center of the scheme in Malta is this company, Henley & Partners, which has a contract who designed the system, with the government, has a contract with the government, a contract that is only partly public, that apparently makes the government compelled to go and participate in road shows selling the system abroad, organized by Henley & Partners. By Henley & Partners organized road show to sell the golden visas, and the Prime Minister and ministers have been participating in these road shows, and this is in the context of the contract, although the government denies, but the fact that they are not compelled, but the fact is that the contract is never fully public. That company is also clearly linked with the Pilatus Bank, which is at the heart of our inquiries on the Panama Papers, and also on the assassination of Daphne, because of course she also wrote extensively about that. Pilatus Bank is this murky bank whose owner of Iranian origin was arrested in the United States this year, and he had St. Kitts and Nevis passport. That's how he was operating a bank in Malta. A St. Kitts and Nevis passport, which had been provided to him some years ago by Henley and Partners, St. Kitts and Nevis. A clear connection is this so-called Nexia BT, another operator involved in the golden visas that is very much intertwined with the whole problems of corruption in Malta. The Prime Minister's Chief of Cabinet, Keith Schembri, is a guy that has been demonstrated by the Maltese FIU, who have been interfering in the golden visas, in the IIP operation. And of course, Henley and Partners was also the company who sued Daphne Caruana Galicia in life, when she was still alive, and sued it after having consulted the Prime Minister. So you see, and I just would urge that a company like Henley and Partners, it's very opaque, very opaque. It's a company that has been, of course, also involved, quoted in links with Cambridge Analytica, namely the parent company SCL. SCL, parent company of Cambridge Analytica, is a company who organized the elections in St. Kitts and Nevis to make sure that they would elect a government that would favor this scheme of sale of passports. So plenty of areas to investigate, and I would say they need scrutiny because they are extremely opaque. We had a conversation with them in the context of our own investigation after Daphne's assassination, and they wouldn't tell us who are the shareholders. And you go and make your own investigation, you don't get much. Other companies such as the Arton Group, which they, by the way, dismiss as not so relevant, not to their standards. The only companies that they think are in their standards of operation, these kind of schemes, are the Big Four. But the other company that they don't think that is up to their standards, Arton Group, you should find out easily. They get Cherry Blair, they get Barroso to come to be a star in their meetings, promotion of the scheme. Portugal. Well, you should know that the case in court, which is where the sentence is due on the 21st of December, it's been postponed and postponed. Now it's scheduled for the 21st of December. It involves the Minister of Home Affairs, who was overseeing the program when it was created. It involves the Secretary General of the Minister of Justice. It involves the President of the Notariat Institute. It involves other people, business people associated with them, and the Chief of the Border Police, although I think that this one is probably was caught in the system. I don't know. Let's see what the court says. But actually it shows corruption at the highest levels. And as I said, in Portugal there is a real lobby, intermediaries lobby, with lawyers and so on, really working for that, really trying to put in the agenda that this is something advantageous to the country, and it is not. And cases have already been mentioned. The cases in Brazil involved in Lava Jato, Chinese citizen, Angola, and so on. The most incredible thing is that there is no publicity at all of the people who are beneficiaries. In Malta, they publish the lists, although mixed, of the beneficiaries of the system, although mixed with all the people that get the naturality of the country. In Cyprus, they publish the list of applicants. But in Portugal, they don't publish anything, and on the contrary, they have denied it repeatedly. The former and the current government, to me namely, who am a member of the European Parliament, and who should and who've been in charge of the work on anti-money laundering directives here in the Parliament. And that is because they know that if I would have access to this list, I would find a lot of crooks, a lot of oligarchs, a lot of theft. And there's no due diligence. It's absolutely perfunctory. There's no STRs from lawyers, societies, no STRs from real estate companies, and so on. So the system is really, and I would just end up by saying, That's why in the 5th Anti-Money Laundering Directive in which I worked in the Parliament, I really insisted on having the golden visas inserted for enhanced due diligence. We were not able to achieve what we wanted. We had, indeed, it's there, enhanced due diligence for the so-called obliged entities, which includes real estate, banks, of course, and lawyers involved, but it doesn't include governments and government agencies. And of course, this is extremely tricky and extremely arbitrary, and it's something that absolutely needs correction. I will end by saying this is indeed a European problem. For years, I was pestering commissioners to act on this, me and other colleagues in the European Parliament, but I was doing that. I'm very pleased that finally in 2017, really based on what I conveyed to Commissioner Jourova and other elements she might have about the Portuguese case in court, she decided to publish the report, to do a report on that. We are waiting for that. It's a really crucial report, and the Parliament will have to act on that.
Thank you very much, Anna. We now go to Benedict. Benedict, if you want to speak for 5 minutes. And
a Syrian citizen who is on the sanction list of the United States because the American authorities accuse him that he is one of the major money laundering man of Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian dictator. And the third story is about Salmo Baska. Salmo Baska, again a Syrian citizen, who is accused by the Italian authorities to be the important member of international money laundering network, and the Italian police and intelligence services is looking for him. What is the common in that three people? The common is that all of them participated in the Hungarian residency bond program, and they were able to travel around in the European Union in spite of accusations by the authorities because they had the golden visa from one of the member states, which is Hungary. And I believe that without using statistics and analysis, just these three very short stories pictures very well that what are the problems with the golden visa programs. And Anna already described very well that besides of the security, national security issues, also the golden visa programs are very closely linked and related to international money laundering activity and corruption. It's linked to geopolitical considerations. One of the major financing and people of the Syrian dictator is moving around freely in the European Union because of the golden visa program. So I believe that it's quite obvious that those programs are not simply something a bit nasty in the member states, but they are creating a major security corruption risk for the European Union. All of the member states, even for those who are not running golden visa programs. And the question was that about all the risks which are represented by the refugees who are coming from war zones, then governments of the European Union are actively letting in people who are clearly representing a high risk for the European Union and the member states. And sometimes it's not only related, and yeah, I know that the time is over, so I try to finish it soon. It's related to corruption not only in the way that corrupt people or people closely related to international global money laundering networks having the opportunity to moving around in the EU freely. But if we have a look on the Hungarian golden visa program, it perhaps has a very specific taste compared to other programs, because mostly the golden visa programs are set up to get money for the state budgets. In Hungary, the program which is not terminated, it's suspended. And the government clearly expressed that any time they can restart it. So it's a suspended program and not a terminated one. In the Hungarian case, altogether, in the 5 years of the Golden Visa program, the scheme for that is that they have to buy governmental bonds for a value of 300,000 euros with an interest rate which actually is higher than the interest rate which the Hungarian state should pay on the capital market. So the Hungarian state is losing money with running the Golden Visa program. Altogether, in the 5 years of the program, something like 20 billion Hungarian forints, which is something like 70-80 million euros, was lost by the Hungarian state because of the Golden Visa program. So the Hungarian taxpayers are paying money for letting in Russian spies, Syrian dictators, best friends and financing people, international money laundering networks. We are paying to let them in. Who is gaining with the program? Of course, those who are buying the residency bonds, and also those intermediary companies who are managing the program. And altogether, those intermediary companies, which are offshore companies, to be sure that everything is well controlled and transparent in the program. So they set up 5 offshore companies to manage the program. And finally, all of the offshore companies have close links to leading governmental people. And those intermediary companies, in the 5 years of this program, they gained €500 million with running the program. So it's related to corruption not only in the way that corrupt people are coming in, but also the program itself is a highly corrupt program, and the aim and the most important goal of the program is not to get money for the state budget for the public, because the public is losing money. The only goal of the program to pump in public money to private pockets. That's the Golden Visa program, and that's what the European Union should step up against.
Thank you very much, Benedict. And now we're going to hear from Rachel Owens from Global Witness.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Thank you so much. It was really interesting to hear the particular insight from the wonderful MEPs on our panel, particularly from Hungary and Portugal. I'm going to focus more on what the EU can do, and particularly highlighting some of the recommendations that Transparency International and Global Witness are putting forward in our report. So when I speak to most friends and family, they're shocked and appalled when I tell them about the fact that the EU is just selling off citizenship and residency rights as a luxury good that can be bought by the highest bidder. And we know that in general, EU citizens across the Union are completely in the dark about the existence of these schemes and the serious corruption risks that they pose to the security and integrity of the EU. So as we've heard over the last hour and so, the main 2 issues are, firstly, that they are not, that they are poorly run, and that there's very limited due diligence undertaken, which is basically allowing the corrupt and criminal into the EU. And secondly, that there's no transparency, which doesn't allow a proper public debate about what kind of risk appetite particular citizens and countries and the EU as a whole wants, and what we deem acceptable when we're handing over huge, when we're accepting huge sums of money in return for passports and visas. So it's critical for the safety of member states and the integrity of the EU that countries offering golden visas are not so dazzled by the potential profit that they neglect to subject applicants to enhanced due diligence, and having conducted that due diligence, actually take into consideration the risks that have come forward. And so obviously these risks are particularly concerning in the EU because we have freedom of movement. So that means that decisions made in Cyprus, Malta, Austria, for example, not only impact the lives of people within that country, but they impact the lives of citizens throughout the EU. And beyond freedom of movement, this complete lack of harmonisation of standards and practices at an EU level on visas and passports adds yet another layer of risk, because it means that member states are encouraged to enter into a race to the bottom. Who can provide the scheme which provides the least checks and the least integrity, so that it attracts as many wealthy elite as possible? After all, the EU is a major selling point for these schemes, despite the fact that they are set up, as Anna said, at a member state level. I had the pleasure to go on holiday to Cyprus earlier this year. As soon as you arrive in the airport, there's a huge stall which basically is selling you these kind of passports and offering services which are very cleverly written, but clearly are saying, we can help you get around the system. And also, why would you get one passport when you can effectively get 27 passports? This is what this is offering. And so what it means is that member states offering these schemes are actually free riding on the asset of the other member states. And the rest of the union is actually paying for this. Member states who don't have this scheme are paying the price for the actions of those that do, not to mention the citizens of those countries that are not getting any of the benefits for these schemes. But what can the EU actually do? So it goes without saying that the passport trade in one member state affects the entire union. It's a cross-border issue, as we've been hearing time and time again over the course of the last hour and a half. After all, perhaps the most attractive thing about the golden visas is the fact that it offers unfettered access to the EU market and that you can travel freely. So it's an opportunity to basically get the passport without any of the rights or responsibilities that normal citizens have to follow. And so we believe that this cross-border effect actually justifies EU action. And one of the questions we often get is, does the EU have the power to act? We believe it does. So a long-held view is that it's only the member states that have the competency to decide who becomes a citizen of the European Union. And we're not denying that this is true, but what we're saying is that because of this cross-border effect, the EU has the competency, and not only the competency, it actually has the imperative to act. So one way would be to look at the principle of sincere cooperation as it's set out in the Treaty of the European Union. And we believe that these schemes go against that very principle of sincere cooperation. Now, it sounds a bit complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. So the European Court of Justice has established this principle that if member states, so it holds member states accountable for actions which contravene the interests of the entire union, such as the security of its citizens. So we argue that some golden visa schemes, many of them, in their current form, go directly against the interests and the security of the union by allowing the corrupt and criminal to bring their dirty money into the EU. Not to mention, as Benedict was saying, the corrupting effects within the member state of the conflicts of interest around these schemes. And we believe that that using this principle, the European Commission should bring infringements and sanctions against member states that actually breach this sincere cooperation through these schemes. And we're not the only ones who think that the EU should act. As already has been mentioned, in August this year, the European Commissioner for Justice, Vera Jourova, had an interview with the Developed newspaper, and she said, and I quote, she said the EU should not be a safe haven for criminals, corruption, and dirty money. And she mentions the golden visas in particular. She says, we don't want any Trojan horses in the EU. Some member states must do more to ensure citizenship is not awarded to criminals. And what we're saying is the Commission has promised to bring out these guidelines that should come in the next couple of months. And this is a really important step forward. It's much better, as Anna and Benedict know, than what we've had in the past. We've had very little action from the EU. However, the big question is, firstly, there's going to be non-binding guidelines, non-legislative. Secondly, are they going to be adopted properly across the board? And also, guidelines are not going to stop this race to the bottom. And so it's clear that from our perspective, the EU has the grounds for curbing these risks associated with, and actually the Commission now needs to use its mandate and act. So just to finish, our key long-term objectives we're in an election year. Next year, the whole European Parliament is going to change. We're going to have a change of political leadership in the European Commission. So these guidelines are the first step, but actually what we need to see is the next political leadership of the EU taking this seriously. It should be a top agenda item in the election. And we're urging a number of things. Firstly, to set EU-wide standards on due diligence, operational integrity and transparency. Secondly, to establish a mechanism to regularly assess the risks and then act on them. So, for example, it could be using the supranational risk assessment that the European Commission produces every 2 years. Thirdly, to broaden the anti-money laundering requirements to make sure that they actually cover the individuals working in the golden visa industry. So to make sure that they are subject to the same checks as banks and other financial players. To set up mechanisms for member states to share information on rejected applicants. So if one member state, Hungary, rejects an applicant, they should make sure that that information is being shared with other member states so that they then can also reject that application. We saw an example, I think it was the example with the Syrian, that they were refused a passport from one member state and then they just went to another member state. It becomes a shopping spree and you just look for the member states that go and checks. And as I said earlier, to bring infringement procedures against member states offering golden visa schemes if they're deemed to be in breach of this principle of sincere cooperation. I'll leave it there, but thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I think the plan is now to kind of have a brief panel discussion and then open the floor to questions as well. Is that okay? I mean, I want to start on this. Let's just start on the issue of we've spoken about what the EU, you think the EU can do, but politically what you think it should do. The member states aren't necessarily going to welcome the EU interfering in individual immigration schemes. I come from the land of Brexit, where we're currently tearing ourselves apart or building a brand new future, depending on who you speak to, and a lot of that was, a lot of the discussion around that was based on concerns around immigration. How realistic is it that member states are going to want to have more interference in immigration schemes from EU level? So, Benedict.
Yeah. So, coming back to, for a moment, to Rachel's contribution, because I believe that the EU not only should act, but the EU, and there is some misunderstanding related to the competences of the EU, because when we are talking about the golden visa issues, they say that, wow, citizenship issues belong to the member states, it's a member state competence, the EU has nothing to do. But first, I believe that the competence of or the right of the member state to deal with the citizenship issues, it's not an absolute right. It does not mean that any of the member states has the right to threaten the security, the national security of other member states. And I believe that from this perspective, the EU has the right to intervene if another member state, other member states' activity, or any of the member states' activity representing a clear and close threat to national security of other member states. Second, the possible measures against those activities or the golden visa programs of the member states are not necessarily related to the citizenship issues. Because just one example that in the EU there are countries not part of the Schengen zone. If I would like to enter the UK, I need my passport. The UK immigration office will control my passport. They will check me, even though we are in the European Union for the moment. But the same with Romania or Bulgaria, which are not part of the Schengen zone. And I think that when we are and Romania and Bulgaria are not joining the Schengen. Okay, the UK it's a special case, but Romania and Bulgaria were not joining the Schengen zone because the European authorities and the Commission was not convinced that the control mechanisms in those countries are enough to ensure the security of the EU. And they didn't let those EU member states to the Schengen zone. Then my question that is it really an obligation for the EU if there are member states which are not part of the Schengen zone and there are other member states who are in the Schengen zone but they are not able to ensure or guarantee that their visas are completely securing the national security of other member states, to say that, okay, there is no restriction for the citizenship procedures, but there might be restrictions on the Schengen rules, which is a clear European competence. Let's say that if the Commission is convinced that the Golden Visa program of a member state represents a clear threat for anti-corruption activity, for national security of the EU and member states, then they can suspend the participation in the Schengen zone till it's not corrected. And a third issue, even in the Schengen zone, there are special cases when, for example, the border control can be reintroduced. And this happened last year, and quite often I'm traveling between Brussels and Hungary, sometimes by car, and for 1.5 years I was stopped on the Austrian-German border because they believed that the refugee crisis represented a clear risk for Germany, and they introduced controls on the border, not suspending Austria's or Germany's participation in the Schengen zone, but they introduced some temporary measures. And this is again possible to introduce temporary measures against those Schengen member states who are running doubtful golden visa programs. So I think, just to conclude, that it's not such a tricky question, because I think that the EU has all the competences to step up against the golden visa program as it is run by a number of member states. The Commission has the competence, has the possible measures, has the right to do that. I think the only question if the Commission has the political appetite to do that. And that's what is finally missing. And from this perspective, I think that it's extremely important to put on the forefront of public interest the golden visa programs with this report, and let's hope that in the Parliament we can do our best to do that, because we have to create the political appetite to do something with this really outrageous golden visa practice in Europe.
Okay, Anna, it sounded like you agree with a lot of that. Again, I want to ask about this question of would you think member states would welcome further guidance on this?
Member states never welcome, but that's exactly what the Commission is there for, to call them to order, namely by infringement procedures and by this kind of directives, so when there is the need. And in this case, there is this race to the bottom, that is unfair competition, that there is a very high security risks, as Benedict was saying, for other member states, but as well for the Union as a whole. So in my opinion, the very minimum should be radical. Forbid the sale. Forbid the sale of citizenship and of passports. That doesn't mean that states don't have the possibility to grant it by political decision, as they do grant humanitarian asylum procedures and so on, for people who make special contributions. But that ought to be, indeed, through harmonized procedures and in full transparency with public scrutiny. It's outrageous that indeed there is no public scrutiny, that people in the different countries that apply these schemes do not know who is applying and who is being granted the beneficiary status. And as you said, it was pointed out, in countries like mine, they even don't do any kind of pretense of due diligence when it comes to family reunification. The Interpol director here in Brussels yesterday pointed out to me, I raised this question with him, that actually people who have a European passport are not going to be extradited. The crooks, the criminals that Benedict just mentioned, may not ever be extradited if they have a European passport by European authorities. So on those grounds, the very minimum is to demand the public scrutiny of the candidates and the beneficiaries. And the reasons that have been invoked, namely by my authorities in Portugal, this government, my political family, as the previous government, right-wing government who created the scheme, has always been data protection. It's absolutely untenable. It's not, I mean, nothing like data protection is preventing Malta and even Cyprus to actually publish lists. And this is the very minimum. But in my opinion, sale should be forbidden.
Okay. I mean, let's ask Rachel, how realistic? I mean, some of the industry's advocates would say this is a $20 billion industry. I mean, that's a very sort of ballpark figure, but how realistic is it to put, as Anna suggests, that genie back in the bottle?
So I just also wanted to answer your previous question, if that's all right, about the kind of political will, because I think, I mean, those of us that have been around this town for a long time in Brussels, we know that basically anything happens when there's political will. So it's really about that. I think this competency question is just a technicality, really. You know, if they really want to do something, exactly as Benedict says, they can. I also think it's really important to notice that we've got 2 representatives of member states here, you know. So what's really interesting is that in the European Parliament there's incredible cross-party support for action on this. So there was a debate in May in European Parliament when numerous MEPs from different political colours, from different member states stood up and said that there should be action. So that's really interesting because, you know, while there may be blockages in governments, you know, so the member states, there's also the other side of the EU, you know, sausage machine, which is the European Parliament, you know, and the European Parliament putting pressure before the elections. And just one final point on that, I think the other thing that's going to be key to this is waking up the 15 member states that don't have this scheme. Because at the moment, you know, there's amazing voices coming from the member states where these schemes are happening and talking about the corruption on the ground. But also, what about the member states that don't even have any choice in this and are just affected by the decisions of other member states? I think that's going to be key also for igniting some more kind of political discussion around this. On the question of banning, I think is a great question, and where we've landed is it's just very difficult to even know if they should be banned because we just don't have enough information. As Carl said, it took months of work by numerous researchers from our organisations to even kind of scratch the surface of this. We just don't have any. There's complete lack of transparency around this. So I think what we need to do is get a lot more information on who these companies are, who they're owned by, how these schemes are operating, how much money is going, where the money is going, who these applications, who these applicants are. And then we can actually have a kind of proper European and member state debate around, do we actually even want these schemes? Are they providing any kind of benefit?
Okay, well, taking that point somewhat further, again, if you speak to any of the companies that run these concessionaires or that advertise these schemes, they will tell you that these are routes for European member states to invite talent and wealth into their country. You know, is that a good point, Bennett?
Well, my
isn't there? Go on. Playing devil's advocate. Isn't there a point there?
My examples, I think, showed quite clearly what kind of talent is arriving to the EU with those programs. So if we need more effective and intelligent criminals, of course that's a good way to have them in the EU. I'm not sure that that's exactly what we would like to see. Your question regarding that, how realistic this is, that it's a 20 billion euros business in the EU. Come on, drug smuggling is an even better business, which does not mean that we shouldn't do something against it. So when there is a business which really threatens security of the EU, threatens the financial interest of the EU and the member states, I think that we have all the reason to step up against it, regardless of how big business this is. And thirdly, of course, what can the question of the ban. And if you ask me, I'm really supporting the idea of banning those golden visa business, and perhaps not because of the security and corruption issues related to the golden visa programs, but simply because I believe that the political community is not a corporation where you can buy yourself in for money with buying the shares. The political community is something completely different. You can decide if someone you want to have in the community and decide on that, But I simply do not think that the political community, which is a nation, should open the doors to become part of the community simply based on money. So I'm completely against, from a theoretical, philosophical or politological consideration. On the other hand, I don't believe that this is something I can explain to Jean-Claude Juncker or any other decision makers in the EU. So I think that what is realistic and what we can do is really to point out the absolute direct risks of the programs, to point out that there is competences and rights for the Commission to act, to find allies in this fight among the member states and in different political groups, and at least to introduce limits of those programs and to set up better control, diligence, involving European institutions, informing the other member states, and so on and so forth, which can limit very much the golden visa programs, and at least which is able to exclude the most obvious risks of the golden visa programs. I hope that on the long run we can go even further, but for the moment we have to close at least the most obvious doors which are open to those crooks and weird people from all over the world to come into the EU.
Okay, but so same question to Anna. I mean, isn't it true that this has helped the Portuguese property market to recover after the crash?
Oh, no, definitely not. Of course, the high segment of housing, only the wealthy segment, and it's distorting the market, actually. People are complaining because parts of the city, the two main cities, Lisbon and Oporto, are being devoid of local population because of the pressure put by these people buying buildings that stay empty because they don't need to be in the country. It's totally different from really attracting talent. I wouldn't be against giving Portuguese citizenship to someone like, for instance, Madonna, who lives now there. And who is, I mean, if she's doing there, she's living there, she is even advertising the qualities of our country. Why not if she asks for that? But giving, not selling, this is really quite perverse. It's indeed a way to stimulate corruption. And in my country, I mean, the situation is so they're like this. We have now in the parliament a proposal by one of the parties that supports the current government to eliminate the golden visas. And you know what? The opinion to draft this, the opinion on this project, draft law, was given to a member of the parliament who is also a lawyer operating in one of the companies whose business line is golden visas. And it was actually the company, the society that provided the golden visa for this Chinese citizen that was sought by the Chinese state for fraud and so on. So it's simply not acceptable. And if there is all this talk of attracting talent, are they trying to measure the talent that has been sinking in the Mediterranean?
Okay. Well, Rachel, I mean, let's broaden this out slightly. Isn't there a slight issue here? If we're talking about solutions that just target EU member states, the EU has visa-free arrangements with several Caribbean states like St Kitts and Nevis, which we've been talking about, that operate their own golden visa schemes. So wouldn't the solutions that we're talking about here actually just drive the business that's currently going into Portugal and Spain and Cyprus to Dominica and St Kitts and Nevis?
I think it's a really good point, and I think we wanted to make sure that came out in the report because I guess what we're talking about is anyone who's got access to the EU. So people who can make the decisions are the EU, and that's why I focused my presentation on where the power hub is here in Brussels, where the decisions can be made. But actually what we need to do is make sure that all of the measures that TI and Global Witness are putting forward also apply to any access to the EU, including, exactly as you were saying, David, these schemes in other countries, for example, in the Caribbean states. Because what we're seeing is it's just another loophole, and so it's actually onus on the EU again in its relationships with those countries to make sure that these golden visa schemes are included in their bilateral discussions, and that they're actually bringing up the corruption and integrity risk that these schemes pose.
Anna, any thoughts on that? Isn't there a problem with wider access in that sense?
What do you mean?
Well, in just what Rachel was talking about there, in the sense that you've got you have visa-free arrangements with non-EU countries that run their own.
Oh yeah, I mean, of course, this is a problem, and we are seeing this problem in the visa waivers that have been negotiated. That really open even more the opportunities for all sorts of organized crime. Europol. I once wrote to Europol about the golden visa schemes, and Europol drew my attention to the fact that indeed the countries that were the major applicants in my country, the origin of the applicants in my countries, were also the countries where major threats were identified in terms of importing organized crime. You can imagine triads, using the family reunification schemes to actually put sleeping cells in the EU for the future. And of course, using these schemes, it will only enlarge even more the possibilities. So I really believe this is a nasty, nasty business. And, if money justifies it all, okay, let's organize a Folie Bergère session with all the prime ministers. I'm sure we'll get as much money as they say that they make with this kind of schemes.
Okay, I think we probably have time for one more question before we open it to the panel. Just very quickly, what guidelines or guidance do you want to see coming out of the Commission guidance that's going to be distributed by Vera Jourova in the next few months?
It's a very good question. I think that I cannot tell you the exact guidelines, but we see clearly that where we have the risks and where we should act on from a European level, and that's clearly a better control of the applicants. In Hungary, the national security has sometimes not more than a few days, 5 to 10 days, to check and control those guys who are applying for this program, which is clearly not enough to map up the security risks of a person, and the Hungarian authorities are not even forced to cooperate with any other European or international bodies, which finally means that there is no proper control over the applicants. And I think that for the moment, that's the major issue, that anyone can enter to the EU with a golden visa program because of the lack of the proper diligence, check and control of the applicant. So I think that at least at this level, the EU and the Commission should introduce some minimum criteria, minimum level of control of the applicants to make it sure that they are properly scrutinized, and we are sure that no people related to the mafia or Russian or any other spies are let in to the EU. And I think that this is really something very important and it's really urgent. So that's the first step we should do. And the second issue, I think, that it's really to map up the competencies of the Commission, in which areas they can act, and to introduce some kind of consequences of breaching the fundamental interests and risk or national security interests of the member states. So we have to introduce sanctions, as I mentioned before. I think that relating this or link this to the Schengen regulation is the right way, because here we have a very, very clear European competence. It's easy to be decided on the Commission level, and it might be quite painful for a member state. Even just being or suspended in the Schengen area for a limited period of time, it's really very problematic for a member state. This could be done, and this could force the member states to improve the golden visa programs or to terminate them.
Okay, very quickly, same question to Anna, and then
I just would like to say, I like to pay tribute to Vera Jourova, because she was the first member of the Commission who really realized that there was a real problem and acted by ordering this report. Because I had, for a number of years, been pestering indeed other commissioners, and they couldn't care less, or they give me this standard reply, this is up to the member states, it's a nationality issue, and so on, which is of course not. It's a European problem, and it puts in question the integrity of Schengen. And now the report is being, I hope that it's supposed to be out in November, that's what was told to us, and it is being done by people from DG Jury,